Everyone, can you all hear me? Okay. So today's panel, Density Preservation, Keeping the Missing Middle, will include a mix of presentation and discussion around strategies to preserve Chicago's existing middle housing, with 2 to 4 unit buildings as a core segment of the stock. First, we'll hear from Diane about how her organization, Communities United, or CU, preserves 2 to 4 flat buildings in Albany Park as part of the Roots Initiative, renters organizing ourselves to stay in response to eviction and displacement pressures. Then we'll hear from Emily about how her organization, the Preservation Compact, supported 2 to 4 flat owners and mission-aligned buyers through a partnership of local CDFIs addressing challenges in communities hardest hit by the foreclosure crisis. Diana and Emily's presentations will be followed by a Q&A and then a discussion. So, to kick it off, Diane Lemus is one of Communities United's, or CU's, founding members and longtime leaders. CU is a community-based organization advancing affordable housing and racial equity in 5 of Chicago's BIPOC neighborhoods: Albany Park, Austin, Belmont-Cragen, Roseland, and Westridge. Diane is currently spearheading the work of preserving 2 to 4 flat buildings across Chicago. She has been instrumental in CU's housing and organizing efforts, working with other housing leaders to create policy that protects renters and property owners. So I'll hand it off to Diane. Oh, she's right there. Sorry, I thought she was over there.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Diane Lemus, and I'm a longtime volunteer leader and board vice president for Communities United. As active participants and advocates in Chicago's housing market for over 21 years, we at Communities United have been pioneers in the preservation of affordable housing. We address issues related to low-income tenants, preserving the identity of our neighborhoods, and addressing the diminishing stock of affordable housing in the city. The uncertainty of Chicago's small 2 to 4 unit buildings has received much attention. Also, a lot of research has been done on this housing stock for over a decade. Yet, the patterns contributing to the loss of this housing stock not only points to the widening racial disparities that are contributing to mass displacement, and this situation has worsened since the pandemic. The loss of affordable 2 to 4 unit rental buildings in Chicago's neighborhoods is at the core of the city's affordable housing crisis. This housing stock is primarily the source of housing for low to moderate income families, providing housing for over a third of the city's predominantly Black and Latino working class residents. This critical, largely unsubsidized stock is experiencing market pressure to convert into single-family homes in high-cost gentrifying neighborhoods and foreclosure and abandonment in low-cost neighborhoods. With over 500,000 people representing nearly half of all Chicago renters living in buildings with 2 to 4 units, the loss of this stock to foreclosure or speculation is devastating. Following the 2008 foreclosure crisis, nearly 1/3 of 2 to 4 flat buildings in weaker housing market neighborhoods were affected by foreclosure filings, contributing to the mass displacement on the south side and west side, contributing to the loss of Chicago's Black population and the staggering loss of wealth in Black communities. In gentrifying areas, 2 to 4s are often swept by speculators, flipped and converted into single-family homes when they came and bought the property, resulting in a significant decline in the number of affordable units in stronger housing markets. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about Roots, Renters Organizing Ourselves to Stay, which is a Community United leader-driven initiative. CU's Roots Initiative was developed in response to the displacement of low-moderate income families that was happening in our neighborhood because of gentrification. Cash investors would purchase foreclosed properties, our 2 to 4 unit buildings, evict the tenants, facilitate a gut rehab, and convert these properties into luxury rental units or very pricey million-dollar homes that longtime residents could not afford. As a result, Chicago was losing a critical portion of its natural occurring affordable rental housing stock in these neighborhoods. CU leaders identified the problem and brought the following key stakeholders together to address the problem. We engaged enterprise community partners. They were willing to provide upfront money to help a mission-minded developer buy these 2 to 4 unit buildings. CU interviewed several mission-minded developers and chose Chicago Metropolitan Housing and Development Corporation as our CU Roots leader. We chose CMHDC and as our Roots developer that would purchase, rehab, and rent foreclosed 2 to 4 flat properties and keep them affordable. Several of the mission-minded developers that we interviewed wanted to work with CU under our Roots initiative. However, the reason we chose CMHDC is because they had upfront money to purchase some of these properties immediately. And we saw firsthand how quickly our 2 to 4 unit buildings were being scooped up by cash investors. Fannie Mae, from the data we received, we knew that Fannie Mae owned 40% of the foreclosed 2 to 4 flat properties in our community. So CU leaders decided to focus on efforts of Fannie Mae and see if they would sell these buildings to CMHDC at a discount. We had to engage the Cook County Land Bank. The Cook County Land Bank helped facilitate the use of donation tax credits for CMHDC because Fannie Mae was unwilling to do it. The land bank helped by holding properties for a short period of time and then give them back to CMHDC so that they could use the donation tax credit program to keep properties affordable for families at the lower end of the pay scale. We needed help from our Congresswoman Schakowsky and our other congressional elected officials. It wasn't always easy working with Fannie Mae, and we needed to engage our elected officials. Getting support from congressmen and women, as well as our senators, was key in getting Fannie Mae to lower their prices on some of these 2 to 4s so that CMHDC would be able to make the numbers work and keep the properties at affordable rentals. I'd like to talk a little bit about CU's community engagement in the Roots process. Again, Roots was created by CU volunteers to address the concern of displacement of innocent renters that were being forced out of their homes by cash investors. CU leaders canvass foreclosed properties regularly to identify buildings available for potential purchase, engage the tenants to support these efforts, brought all major stakeholders together and arranged and participated in meetings with relevant stakeholders, and provided general oversight and consultation of the project. By engaging tenants, we were able to work with them so that they would be ready to share their personal experiences with our elected officials and with the media. Through Roots, CU worked with key partner organizations to preserve over 40 units of family-sized rental housing and have expanded the number of stakeholders through this work to advance opportunities for low-income families to have quality, affordable, and accessible housing that is well connected to jobs, transit, schools, health centers, and other critical community services. The City of Chicago created PAIR, Preserving Existing Affordable Rentals, their program based on our Roots initiative. The PAIR program is designed to financially support mission-driven developers that acquire, rehab, and preserve 2 to 4 unit buildings as affordable. I'd like to talk about what's happening with our 2 to 4s and the pandemic. Landlords of our 2 to 4 flats have relied on rents to make their mortgage payment. Yet the economic impact of the pandemic and the challenges faced by many households seeking to access rent and mortgage relief makes these landlords more vulnerable to foreclosure, further threatening the well-being of their tenants and further loss of this iconic housing stock. Annually, 2 to 4 account for nearly 24% of foreclosure filings citywide. The pandemic has led to unaccustomed actions from local, state, and federal governments to protect tenants and property owners alike. Yet, the vulnerability of this 2 to 4 housing stock is not sufficiently targeted in many of the solutions that are emerging. If we want to prevent a displacement disaster, protecting and preserving our 2 to 4 unit housing stock needs to be at the forefront of any recovery strategy. I'm going to repeat this because it's very, very important. If we want to prevent the displacement disaster, protecting and preserving the 2 to 4 unit housing stock needs to be at the forefront of any recovery strategy. Now I'd like to talk about a new initiative that CU is a member of, and it's called the Chicago Flats Initiative. The Chicago Flats Initiative, or CFI initiative, is objective is to preserve 2 to 4 flats across Chicago and preserve housing for Black and Latino immigrant families while fostering wealth building through home ownership. This collaborative is made up of grassroots community organizations and direct service organizations working together with the assistance of policy, legal, and technical advisors. Preservation of affordable housing is central to the health of individuals and communities and essential to advancing racial equity. CFI and its collaborative partners are working to develop a comprehensive strategy addressing the loss of this 2 to 4 housing stock and displacement of residents. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane. Okay, next up we have Emily Bloom Carlin, who is the Senior Program Officer at the Preservation Compact, a policy collaborative focused on preserving affordable rental housing. The compact brings together government, developers, lenders, civic groups, and community groups to drive preservation strategies. Emily's work at the compact is focused on developing policies, tools, and incentives to preserve the small to medium-sized, affordable yet unsubsidized housing stock. And her previous work spans property tax policy, equitable pandemic recovery, and ADUs. Thanks.
Hey everyone, I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about preserving 2 to 4 unit buildings here in Chicago. Like Jesse said, my name is Emily Bloom Carlin. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the Preservation Compact. And today I'm going to do a couple of things. So first, I'm going to talk about some of the general preservation strategies we think about at the Compact when we're approaching preserving 2 to 4 unit buildings. I'm going to talk about a case study that illustrates some of these strategies. And then I'm going to talk about some promising models from either Chicago or other jurisdictions that could help us preserve 2 to 4 unit buildings going forward. So, first I want to talk a tiny bit about the Preservation Compact. We're a policy collaborative housed at Community Investment Corporation, which is a nonprofit community development financial institution lender. And we bring together a really diverse set of partners, including all levels of government, for-profit and nonprofit developers, lenders, community-based organizations, tenant advocates, and more. And we bring these folks together to focus like a laser on preserving our existing affordable stock, both the government-assisted properties and those that are naturally occurring affordable, right? Properties that are affordable but don't have any subsidy. And so, why does the Compact care about 2 to 4s? Well, first, if you are in Chicago and you care about affordable rental, you should really care about 2 to 4s. They're abundant. A third of our rental units in Chicago are located in 2 to 4 unit buildings. And we know that rents in 2 to 4 unit buildings tend to be lower than rents in other buildings, right? So they're an important source of naturally occurring affordable housing. And like Diane said, they are being lost, right, across the city. In higher cost and gentrifying areas, we're losing them when they're converted to high-cost luxury single-family homes. And in Chicago's historically disinvested communities on the south and west sides, we are losing them to disinvestment, and demolition. And so a lot of folks today here are talking about and excited about new construction. New construction is great too, but we need to preserve these existing units, right? And because, and that's because, that helps us prevent displacement, right? There are people living in these buildings now, and they tend to be low and moderate income, Black and brown renters, right? So by preserving these buildings, we help keep those folks in their homes, right? And once we lose a 2 to 4 unit building, it is really hard to replace them, right? Restrictive zoning might prevent it. Cost might prevent it, right? It's almost always much more affordable to preserve an existing unit than it is to construct a new affordable unit. And by focusing on preservation, which is less expensive, we can help stretch our existing scarce subsidy dollars and help them go further. So again, that's why they're important. Here's some of the ways that we think about preserving 2 to 4s at the compact, right? So there are a few general strategies. This isn't exhaustive, but here are some strategies that we think about. So one, we can help current owners maintain their buildings and continue to offer high quality, affordable units, right? We can help preservation buyers acquire these buildings and crowd out speculators. And we can work together to develop diverse, coordinated partnerships to address these issues broadly and holistically. And so I want to show how these approaches sort of played out in practice. And so I'm excited to tell you about a real success story that the compact played a role in, right? So following the financial crisis, historically disinvested neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Chicago recovered much more slowly than rich, wealthy neighborhoods on the north side, right? And like Diane said, these 2 to 4 unit buildings were particularly vulnerable to foreclosure, right? From 2008 to 2012, 31% of 2 to 4 unit buildings in low and moderate income neighborhoods in Chicago were directly affected by a foreclosure filing, right? So they were particularly at risk of foreclosure. And what we saw as a result of that is we saw that they were vacant, they were in poor condition, they needed rehab to be livable either for owner occupants or tenants living in those units. And we saw 2 big risks emerge, right? One, that these properties would be lost to demolition entirely. At the time, owner occupants who could qualify for a mortgage generally didn't want to purchase a distressed 2-flat on a block of other distressed 2-flats, right? And so these units were often staying empty, but there was a large demand for affordable housing, right? So some of these units, the first risk is that these units would be lost to demolition, right? That these buildings would be vacant, abandoned, and deteriorate. And the second risk is that we saw a huge increase in speculator activity in these communities at the time. These folks were attracted by the low values and often made cash offers, acquiring properties and either holding them vacant or doing very, very shoddy rehab that didn't do anything to address sort of the longer-term structural issues that we saw in a lot of these buildings. Right? So the Preservation Compact did what we do best, and we convened that diverse set of partners that I talked about at the beginning, right? Lenders, community-based organizations, tenant advocates, foreign nonprofit developers, and that ultimately led to the CDFI Collaborative, right, which was a partnership between 3 local community development financial institutions, Community Investment Corporation, where the compact is housed, the Chicago Community Loan Fund, and Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago. And together, seeded with a grant from Chase for $5 million, they put together a portfolio of programs that address some of these challenges that we identified in these low and moderate income neighborhoods that were recovering so slowly, right? And so with these programs, they were also very intentional about targeting geographies that were also being assisted by other programs, right? So they targeted MMRP areas, they targeted areas that were getting targeted code relief and code enforcement efforts. They targeted areas that were sort of places where people were doing substantial foreclosure prevention outreach. So they were targeted in order to, again, stretch those scarce resources farther. They also did one other thing that's somewhat unique in preservation, right? So they partnered with responsible private investors and developers as preservation partners. That's not to say that mission-driven developers weren't involved. They absolutely were, but the enormity and the scale of the issue that needed to be addressed required us to leverage efficient, fast-moving, responsible, small investors and developers. So, again, thinking back to those 3 strategies I shared at the beginning, to help preservation buyers, right? And in this case, I'm talking about some mission-driven developers, but again, mostly small for-profit investors committed to preserving these properties. CIC used a portion of their grant from Chase to create an acquisition pool, right, which allowed us to directly acquire distressed properties and save them from speculators in that way. We had long experience in acquiring distressed properties, so we could do it really efficiently, much more efficiently than sort of small private investors or mission-driven developers. The other thing we had a lot of experience doing was vetting borrowers, right? For 30 years, CIC had lent in these neighborhoods on larger multifamily buildings. And so we had sort of a lot of experience overseeing construction, vetting borrowers. And what we did is we went out when there were investors who were interested in participating in this program. We looked at the quality of their construction work that they had done in other projects to make sure they had a strong track record. And we talked to their tenants to make sure that they were good owners, right? And so once we acquired these properties and identified good, responsible developers, we assembled and sold packages of these properties to these responsible investors, right? And so once they had these buildings, right, they needed rehab in order for them to be more livable. And so CCLF took part of their Chase funding and they used it as a loan loss reserve, right, for high loan to value rehab loans that were short term but really important. And the high loan to value was so important, right, because the assessed values of these properties were really low, which made it really hard to access conventional rehab financing to do the work that was needed in them, right? Then once folks had completed their rehab, CIC had one other product that helped these responsible owners sort of take out that short-term financing and stabilize these sort of 1 to 4 unit buildings into portfolios that they could either manage as responsible investor owners as affordable rental, or they could resell to owner occupants. So along with these financing tools, though, there was an enormous effort between CIC and CCLF to vet the borrowers, right? Make sure that only the most responsible developers capable of doing the highest quality work participated, to monitor the construction work as they did it, to make sure that the work was done well, and to build the capacity of these responsible owners through education, training, partnership, and other outreach in the community. And so what did we do to help existing owners, right? Well, we took almost the exact same approach. So Neighborhood Housing Services of Chicago, which works with owner occupants primarily, did some very similar things to support existing owners, right? They took some of their Chase money and they put together a high loan to value rehab loan product for owner occupants. They also did an enormous amount of outreach, engagement, and capacity building for owner occupants to help them get through the process of rehabbing their distressed 2 to 4 unit building, right? Like Stephen said, it isn't easy to rehab your building. A lot of people, even people who are savvy and understand the process and have done it before, need extra support around the construction process, right? And so together, over the course of the grant period, which started in 2014, we preserved almost 600 units in 1 to 4 unit buildings, again, during the grant period. While the sort of formal collaboration wound down at the end of that grant period, CIC, CCLF, and NHS continue to offer all of these programs, right? Acquisition, rehab, takeout financing, and capacity building support to owner occupants and small responsible developers. The other thing that we've seen over the past couple of years since the grant period wound down was a resurgence in owner occupancy, right? So during the grant period, the majority of the units touched by CIC and CCLF were used as affordable rental housing, right? That was their final disposition. That's swapped in the past couple of years. Most of the buildings touched by these programs now are going ultimately to owner occupants, which is really exciting. So again, the impact in this case was driven by doing the things that we usually do, right? Coordinating with partners to support owners who are already in the community, coordinating also to help preservation buyers intervene and acquire properties to keep them out of the hands of speculators and irresponsible investors. And that's why we were so excited to have such an enormous impact. Since the grant period has wound down, we've done another 500 plus units on these in these communities. So again, that's how we did it with the Chicago CDFI Collaborative. It's a similar model to what Roots did, which was wonderful and exciting, right? And so now I want to talk a little bit more, and I'm going to be quick, I promise. I don't want to stand between people and their lunch, about some promising new models that can do some of these same things, right? So the first is, what can we do to help current owners maintain their buildings, right? When we talk to owners of 2 to 4s, whether they're owner occupants, mission-driven developers, or small responsible investors, they tell us that it's actually pretty hard to own and operate a small rental property, right? They might need extra support to do it well. And when we talk to them too, these folks agree with us that it's important to preserve these properties, right? But they also express fear. They're worried that because for many of them, their greatest investment is their home, they're worried that by preserving these 2 flats, we're somehow going to harm them, right? So that's why one of the ways we can help preserve these buildings is by supporting existing owners, right? And here's some ideas for how we can do that. So one of the first and easiest things is to put together a centralized resource hub, right? There are a lot of actually existing resources out there for 2 to 4 unit buildings but there isn't a centralized repository of them, right? So we could build a website that just has a sort of consolidated list of all of the programs that folks could take advantage of. We could also learn from the Chicago Bungalow Initiative, which has had great success preserving other types of vintage buildings in Chicago, right? We could put together a staffed one-stop shop for resources, education, and coordinated advocacy on behalf of the owners of these buildings and the tenants who live in them. The other thing we could do is we could help property owners make it easier to manage their properties. That could be giving them training so they can become better, more efficient managers, or it could be something like helping them access reliable, reasonable, effective contractors, right? So again, it could just be a list, like Steven said earlier. It could be a list from NHS of contractors who are going to do a good job and who understand how to work with 2-4s. It could be something like a pilot program, a really exciting pilot program that they're doing in Los Angeles, right, where they're building a small contractor network to support small owners of rental properties. The idea is that by providing regular preventative maintenance, you can help ward off larger problems down the way that could lead to the loss of the building. Lastly, there are a ton of things that we could talk about related to property taxes and 2-4s. That's a major concern that we hear from owners, in particular owner occupants of 2-4 unit buildings. I could talk about property taxes for like 5 hours, but in the interest of lunch, come up to me during lunch and ask me about it. So I'm going to skip forward. But suffice it to say, there are absolutely tweaks that we could make to existing exemptions that are on the books that could help support 2-4 owners, and we could make better use of the Chicago Housing Trust, which generally, so when properties are entered into the Chicago Housing Trust, they are assessed based on their restricted value versus their market value. So that can be a way to help owner occupants with property taxes. That's not a solution that's going to work for everyone, but it could be interesting to explore more. Okay, we could also just give them loans and grants, right? So, and that could look like loans, low-cost loans to finance maintenance that's forgiven over time in order to encourage long-term ownership, right? Because we know that units in buildings owned by long-term owners tend to be more affordable. We could also sort of take the example of the PAIR program, right? And we could refinance existing private debt in a way that supports long-term affordability for the rental units. And lastly, again, we could give people grants to help them do the work that they need to do. It could be for rehab and maintenance. It could be to sort of expand the capacity of their building, add another rental unit, and increase their rental income by putting an ADU in. This isn't on the slide, but another way that we can do this is by offering tenants subsidies, right? So either a tenant-based subsidy or offer a project-based subsidy for the owners, for the units. Okay, again, I'm going to try and go through this really quickly. But so the other thing we can do, right, is when these properties do come on the market, because no matter how much support you give to someone, there are reasons that they will need to sell at some point or that the properties will change hands, right? And so what we can do is we can help preservation buyers acquire these properties. And preservation buyers, again, could be responsible investors committed to keeping the buildings in good condition and keeping them affordable. They could be mission-driven developers. But again, in this case, I'm mostly thinking about non-resident owners, right, or investor owners. And so, traditional sources of financing for affordable housing are great and vital and important, but they move really slowly. And so what we hear from preservation buyers, when we ask them, what can we do to help you preserve more 2-4 unit buildings? They say that we can develop faster moving financing, right? So they can compete with the well-capitalized investors and the speculators who are able to sort of purchase properties, particularly in gentrifying and high-cost areas where the cost per unit can be $300,000 or more to acquire the building, right? And so there are a bunch of existing programs that offer us good models for developing tools that mission-driven developers, preservation buyers will actually use and that will be effective in competing in these market transactions. The Roots Initiative provides a great example. Enterprise provided a low-cost line of credit to CMHTC to help them acquire those properties. There's some really exciting models from other parts of the country that effectively, move quickly, are low cost, and allow preservation buyers to acquire a property and then assemble a more traditional affordable housing financing structure after that. So those are some existing programs. Again, happy to talk more about any and all of these. I think this is a really exciting direction. So lastly, again, what we need to do is we need to continue to develop diverse, coordinated partnerships in order to move this work forward, right? And that's why, like Diane, I am so excited about the Chicago Flats Initiative, right? This is a new collaborative effort, and the Compact is really excited to be participating because first, it is being led by community-based organizations from across the city, right? The strategies that we are developing are directly targeted to the needs that folks are seeing in their communities and their needs. It also brings together a wide range of partners. Again, like Diane said, it's bringing together folks with expertise in organizing, in lending, in community development, philanthropy, research, and more. And lastly, it is taking this broad and holistic approach, right? It's not trying to pick off properties necessarily one at a time, which is good and which is what we did, right? But it's thinking about how can we change the structures and the policies that will help us preserve more of these really important parts of our rental stock here in Chicago. I'm excited to talk more about any and all of these. Like I said, please, my contact information is up there on the slide. That QR code should, fingers crossed, take you to the Preservation Compact's website where you can learn more about the work that we do on 2 to 4s and all sorts of other affordable properties. I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, now we're gonna open up to Q&A. So anyone that has a question, in the gray sweater, go ahead.
Hi, thank you both for your presentations. I really appreciate them. I teach about buildings of this scale and really value all the work y'all are doing. Emily, I have a question mainly for you, but really for both of you. You talked about crowding out speculators, but you didn't on your list talk about specifically political or policy initiatives that could potentially severely limit or ban land speculation of different kinds. I'm thinking about speculation of the sort of smaller scale of, people wanting to make a quick buck, but also larger scale companies, especially outside interests coming in and systematically speculating on land, which really screws up local efforts like yours. And even, honestly, major institutions like the University of Chicago, which has historically been a land speculator. And I mean, maybe it's a little much to say that those blueberry smoothies were paid for by land speculation, but it's not that much of a stretch. And so I wonder, you're doing a lot of very positive things on a small scale, but is a kind of policy or political approach to actually fight land speculation part of your strategy or part of a possible strategy?
Yeah, I mean, can folks hear me okay? Okay, great. I think that's a great question, and I think it's really important. And I think, so again, we are focused, my work is focused a lot on financing tools and ways to leverage incentives and other sort of carrots, for want of a better word, to encourage folks to preserve these properties. But absolutely, yes, policies and political will to prevent speculation is also important. And I think, Daniel this afternoon is going to talk a little bit more about some policies that prevent sort of the loss of these 2 to 4 unit buildings from sort of a zoning and policy and political, or sort of an anti-speculation approach. So, but yes, absolutely, they should be part of our approach, and they're really important.
And if I could add to that, I think you hit it right on the nose. I think you have to have a strong political will, right? If we're going to create policy, right? And I think that everybody likes to say the word preservation. That's a nice word to say. But how much are our elected officials doing toward preservation, especially of our 2 to 4 housing stock, right? That's what we need to get, started, the political will. Because we know what's happening in the southwest sides, and we know that a lot of funding has gone into the southwest, and rightfully so, because those neighborhoods have been disinvested in for years and years. However, in Albany Park, where I live, and where we have some of our leaders here today from Communities United, gentrification has taken a massive hold on the longtime residents. And our Latino families are being displaced all the time. And when we went to the city to say, hey, what can we do to stop this displacement of families in Albany Park? We heard that, no, there was no money in the budget for Albany Park. So, in other words, I see it as, okay, the city isn't really concentrating on those Latino families that are being displaced in gentrifying areas, right? So the political will is important, and unless we get the political will, nothing's going to be done. And at a larger, scale that you're just talking about, what happened with the U of I, yes, again, you have to add our elected officials that were in power at that time. You have to put some blame on them as well. So until we get the political will that's really going to work by helping the displacement that's going on in gentrifying areas, then we're always going to have this problem. Again, everybody likes to say the word preservation, but exactly how much preservation are we doing, especially in gentrifying areas? And until we figure out, we know that roots and pair works. CMHDC was able to preserve 42 units of affordable housing in Albany Park. That meant that 42 families were not displaced, and they're living in apartments that are affordable. So we need to put more money into pair, a lot more money into pair. If we need to tweak pair, we need to sit at the table and tweak it and fix it and make sure that our gentrifying areas are being protected as well, especially longtime residents. So that was a good question.
So you talked about market forces really driving this displacement, and you also talked about scale, that this is where a third of the rental homes in the city of Chicago are. So what is it going to take in either public investments or policy changes to staunch the loss of NOAA unsubsidized homes that happen to be affordable for a whole host of reasons?
Yeah, I mean, so again, what we see in Chicago is that just to sort of speak to your point, preserving an existing unit of affordable housing, particularly in a small rental building, can be done for between $50,000 and $150,000 per unit, right? Which is substantially lower than the cost of constructing new affordable units. Again, both of those are so important, and we can't address our affordable housing shortage in Chicago without doing both of those things. But again, so if you're thinking about the per unit cost, there are absolutely ways to sort of develop some of these programs, some of the things I discussed, or to build on some of the programs that Diane discussed, like Roots and the PAIR program, and sort of put additional funds into them to sort of build and grow the impact, right? It's fine to pick off properties one at a time. That's what we've been doing. And sort of the reason that we're so excited about the Chicago Flats initiative is that it is bringing folks together from across the city who have the capacity to sort of come up with big asks and advocate for them, right? And I think, so if you look, for example, one of the models that I had on my slide about helping preservation buyers is the Boston Acquisition Opportunity Program. And so that's a really similar program focused on helping mission-driven developers or just folks who are willing to commit to long-term affordability compete to acquire naturally occurring affordable housing properties, right? And so they've seeded their initial program with $20 million. And so far they've had enormous effect, right? I think they've preserved, I want to say like 600 or 700 units just in this initial period of the program, right? So we can actually take this money and go really far with a relatively small amount of sort of investment. I think there are also so many wonderful programs out there that we can bring together under sort of the same roof or put additional funds into that can do this work if we can find a way to make them a little bit more coordinated and collaborative.
And if I could say that the CMHDC rehab their units anywhere from $130,000 to $150,000 a unit. If you're going to create a new unit of housing, it's going to cost anywhere from $300,000 to $500,000 a unit. So you would think that our elected officials, our aldermen, would really jump at the chance of saving all this money by rehabbing and preserving affordable housing that we have already. But they don't get excited about that for some reason. Can't figure that out. So, yeah.
Do either of you see zoning as a potential solution to the problem at hand? Because I don't think either of you mentioned zoning. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, so zoning solutions are really important, right? They're, I would say, necessary but not sufficient, right? One of the reasons why it's so hard to replace these units when we lose them is that they're, like folks showed earlier this morning, there's so few places where you can build a new 4-flat in Chicago, right? And zoning is part of that reason. I do think there absolutely are other zoning solutions. And again, I don't want to spoil Daniel's presentation this afternoon, but he's going to really dive into some of the ways that we can use zoning to preserve this existing stock and make it easier to build new buildings. So more to come.
Yeah, and I think zoning is very, very important. However, zoning is not going to stop a deconversion.
Hi, thank you both so much. I'm curious to hear what you both have to say about private companies who are especially interested in things like employer assisted housing, which is becoming a very large topic now, especially. What you both think, like, what are some incentive structures that we can put in place to engage private companies, and understanding that, this sort of preservation model is significantly cheaper than having you create some sort of fund that then goes towards construction of new properties, which again, like you're both saying, is very important. But from a, if we're thinking about a strict profit seeking enterprise, they're looking to minimize costs. And so this seems like a very obvious way, but it's not something that's really been taken up as much. So I'm curious if either of you have ideas for incentives to engage them.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One thing that we hear a lot, in addition to the need for fast sort of acquisition financing, right, is that private developers in particular need to get to scale in order to make the preservation of small rental buildings possible, right? So if you have a 55 unit building, in some ways it is easier to manage, at least with traditional third-party property management systems approaches, than if you have an assortment of 2 to 4 unit buildings that get you to 55 units, right? Each of those buildings is separate. They each have their own roof, right? Like they each have their own maintenance needs. And so part of the challenge, and one of the ways that I think we can get at that, is thinking about ways to, acquire and assemble these sort of portfolios of properties for sort of private developers who are willing to commit to preservation, right? And that's sort of what we did on a smaller scale with the CDFI collaborative, right? We were able to purchase and assemble these buildings, and so instead of having to go transaction by transaction to acquire 9 2 flats, folks could just purchase sort of a collection of buildings at once. And one other interesting thing I wanted to mention about that sort of packaging process is it's also a good way to sort of encourage the acquisition of really, really, really distressed properties that otherwise a private investor might want to take, right? So you can take these really, really, really distressed properties that are going to need a lot of work and package them with nearby properties that are in better condition, and offer that and sort of price them in a way that effectively offers a subsidy for those really good condition buildings that can help finance the rehab, or that can help with the rehab of the sort of lower or the more distressed properties. So I would say that's one approach. There are certainly, I'm sure, other approaches as well. I don't want to talk over Diane. There's one other approach, is thinking about ways. There's a new property tax incentive that the Compact and other partners who are here in the room worked a lot on, called the Affordable Housing Special Assessment Program. It basically provides property owners, whether they are mission-driven or for-profit, a reduction in their assessed value, so effectively a reduction in their property taxes if they commit to investing in their building and to holding a portion of those units affordable. Right now, that property tax incentive only applies to buildings with 7 or more units. One of the ways that we could think about property taxes, and one of the ways we could think about activating sort of more private developers to do this work, is find out and think about strategies to help this also cover portfolios of smaller properties or individual smaller properties.
So I just like to, I agree with everything that Emily said, but I just like to point out this Preservation Compact's recent victory on the property tax relief points out that 7 and over units, again, the 2 to 4 flat wasn't part of any of that policy. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very hard for anyone to create policy that's specific to our 2 to 4 flats, that's protecting our renters as well as the owners. I'm just pointing that out.
No, and I totally agree. And, Diane, from the early stages, working with you all, when we first took this proposal out to stakeholders, it was 2+ unit buildings. And what we heard is, that's not possible. We can't do that. There's no way to approach this. Why don't you increase this to 7 units, right? And so that was a compromise that was made as part of the legislative and outreach process, but I think there's so much more we can be doing there. I totally agree with Diane.
I think I saw a question with Greg waiting.
I just had a question. We know, at least in Chicago, that the majority of the loss of 2 to 4 units have been mainly in the zone of affluence, Lincoln Park, Lakeview, and the Northwest Side. And yet a lot of the initiatives that I'm seeing are really trying to preserve 2 to 4 units in areas that aren't really seeing that kind of loss of housing stock. When we enact these, or when I see politicians creating these policies, it seems like they are exempting the areas where we're actually seeing the greatest loss of housing. And that is something that's always bothering me because I'm like, well, if we believe in affordable housing in Lakeview, why don't we leave that of Lincoln Square or the South Side or the West Side? So is there anything that can be done to make sure that we're not zoning in, pun intended, I guess, of just saying this one area is where we need to preserve 2 to 4 unit housing, because that is only going to make the disparities between rich and poor communities even greater. We're essentially redlining some areas versus some other ones, and that's already been done.
But I think there's been a lot of loss of 2 to 4s on the west, southwest, and on the south side due to demolition, because of letting a 2 to 4 of the owner just abandoning the house and moving away, and it sits there and sits there till the city comes in and demolishes it. And they've lost a lot of 2 to 4 housing stock due to foreclosure, and that's a fact. But I do agree with you that if something isn't done about saving existing residents, longtime residents that are living in gentrifying areas, the city's going to be known as the biggest gentrifier in the city, because that's exactly what's happening. Our brown and black communities are being forced out. Wealthy people coming in. Not that we have anything against wealthy people. We know when they come in, we get more resources. Our schools gets better. Our everything gets better. So we're not opposing wealthy people coming into our neighborhood, but we truly are opposing when longtime residents are displaced because of that. All these telephone numbers to reach these certain entities that could help them. And that's the first thing we did. We put together a huge landlord survey from our 2 to 4 unit landlords, owner-occupied buildings. What is your concern? What do we have to do to keep you from your property going into foreclosure? What do we have to do to make sure that you don't sell to a speculator? Because right now in Albany Park, I live in Albany Park and I have a 2-flat. And I'm getting 3 calls a week from real estate people and developer. Hey, I'll buy your property. I'll give you top dollar and I will pay cash. 3 calls a week, and I get at least that many postcards. So they are really attacking our neighborhood. So we need to pass out information. We need to hear from them. We need to hear from the landlord. What do you need so that you don't go into foreclosure and you don't sell to a cash investor? So we're doing that. And of course, Emily's suggestion on getting one area where people can call and find out different things that they need to protect their 2 to 4 unit building would be great.